The Aztec Tlatoani. High in the heart of Tenochtitlan, on the blood-dark steps of the Templo Mayor, the rulers of the Aztec Empire presided over something that no other civilization in the ancient world organized quite so deliberately or at quite such a scale. The Tlatoani, the supreme speaker, the god king at the apex of the Triple Alliance, did not merely tolerate cannibalism as a side effect of warfare. He institutionalized it, scheduled it, and consumed it himself as an act of divine communion. When captive warriors were brought to the sacrificial stone, their chests opened with obsidian blades dark as volcanic glass, their still-beating hearts lifted toward the sun in honor of Huitzilopochtli. What came next was not chaos. It was protocol. The bodies were carefully carried down the pyramid steps, and the flesh, specifically the thighs and upper arms, the meatiest and most prized portions, was distributed according to rank, with the highest-born nobles and the Tlatoani's inner circle receiving first. The flesh was stewed in clay pots alongside maize, prepared without salt and without chili, because those seasonings were reserved for animals. The distinction was deliberate and meaningful. This was sacred food, consumed by sacred men. Estimates of the number of people sacrificed annually across the empire range from a few thousand to tens of thousands, though the upper figures remain hotly disputed among modern scholars, and the lower end is almost certainly more accurate. What is not disputed is that Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who walked through Tenochtitlan with Cortés in 1519, documented the Tzompantli, the great skull rack standing near the Templo Mayor, and described it in terms that left his Spanish readers pale. The consumption itself was never casual. To eat a great warrior was understood as absorbing his strength, his fighting spirit, his accumulated courage, passing into your own body through the act of ingestion. Some scholars, most notably Michael Harner in 1977, controversially argued that the entire system was driven partly by protein deficiency in the Aztec diet, a nutritional necessity dressed in religious clothing. Mainstream archaeology has largely rejected this interpretation, pointing instead to the overwhelming cosmological logic of the system. The sun required blood and flesh to keep moving across the sky, and the Tlatoani was the man responsible for making sure it did. When the Spanish arrived and eventually dismantled Tenochtitlan stone by stone, they framed their destruction of the empire partly as a civilizing mission against this practice. The irony is that their accounts, useful as they are, were written by men who had every political reason to make the Aztecs sound as monstrous as possible. The Ratu chiefs of Fiji. On the opposite side of the world, on a chain of green islands rising from the South Pacific, Fijian, chiefly culture, developed one of the most thoroughly documented and deliberately practiced traditions of political cannibalism anywhere in the recorded historical record, and it lasted, in some form, well into the 19th century. The Ratu, the hereditary chiefs who commanded Fijian society, did not eat their enemies out of hunger or even purely out of spiritual obligation. They did it as the most complete and devastating political statement available to them. To defeat an enemy chief in battle was one thing. To consume his body in front of his surviving kin, on his own land, surrounded by his own people, was something else entirely. It was annihilation made literal, a message delivered in the most visceral possible terms about who now held power and what that power meant. Fijian society maintained specialist roles, designated men responsible for the preparation and cooking of bodies, and the feasts themselves were tied to significant political transitions, major military victories, the funerals of important chiefs, and the installation of new rulers. The most extreme individual case in the historical record belongs to Ratu Udre Udre, a 19th century chief from the Ra province on Viti Levu, who is recorded in oral tradition as having consumed somewhere between 872 and 999 people over his lifetime, keeping a stone for each victim in a pile beside his compound. His grave and the associated stone collection are reportedly still visible in Rocky Rocky. That figure comes from oral tradition rather than written documentation and should be treated as a historical claim rather than a verified statistic, but it was significant enough that Guinness World Records has cited it. What is not disputed at all is the 1,867 killing of Reverend Thomas Baker, a British Methodist missionary who made the fatal mistake of removing a comb from a chief's hair, an act of profound disrespect in Fijian custom, and was subsequently killed and eaten along with his companions. Even his leather boots were reportedly thrown into the cooking fire, though they proved too tough to eat. In 2003, Baker's descendants received a formal apology from the Fijian government, delivered in a traditional ceremony, Acknowledging that the killing had brought spiritual consequences the community still felt. The conversion of Fiji to Christianity under sustained missionary and colonial pressure effectively ended the practice by the close of the 19th century. But for roughly 2 centuries before that, it was a cornerstone of how the Ratu maintained political authority not as barbarism, but as statecraft. The Khmer Royal Court. Built from gray sandstone dragged across the Cambodian plain, the temples of Angkor represent one of the most sophisticated civilizations the medieval world produced, and the god kings who ruled the Khmer Empire from those temple complexes, the Deva Raja, the divine king, literally the king who was a god operated within a ritual framework so extreme that almost nothing was considered beyond their sacred authority. What makes the Khmer case difficult to assess is the thinness of the direct evidence. The most frequently cited primary source is Zhou Daguan, a Chinese diplomat who spent roughly a year at the Angkor court between 1296 and 1297, and wrote a detailed account of what he observed. His text references ritual practices that some historians have interpreted as involving consumption of specific substances from the royal body or from defeated enemies as part of succession ceremonies, though the translation and interpretation of the relevant passages remain genuinely contested among scholars, and it would be dishonest to present this as settled fact. What the archaeological and art historical record does confirm, unambiguously, is that the Khmer court normalized extreme ritual violence on a vast scale. The bas-reliefs at Angkor Wat stretch for nearly half a mile and depict warfare, judgment, and punishment. In meticulous carved detail, this was a civilization that thought deeply about what the body could mean as a political and spiritual instrument. The Deva Raja system held that the king's body was literally divine, that his physical substance held cosmic power, and the question of what happened to that power when a king died or was overthrown was not merely political but metaphysical. In a system with those premises, the ritual treatment of a defeated rival king's body, including, possibly, its partial consumption to transfer his royal mana to the victor, follows a logical pattern visible across multiple cultures operating under similar cosmological assumptions. The Khmer Empire collapsed gradually through the 14th and 15th centuries under a combination of Thai military pressure, internal succession violence, and ecological stress, and the records that might have documented court ritual most precisely were lost in that collapse. What remains is partial, filtered through Chinese diplomatic observation and temple carving, and should be understood as suggestive rather than conclusive. The House of Plantagenet. Medieval England is not typically the first place that comes to mind when the subject of royal cannibalism arises, but the Plantagenet dynasty, which ruled England from Henry II's coronation in 1154 through to the end of Richard III's reign in 1485, produced at least one king whose documented behavior at the table crossed a line that even his own chroniclers found worth recording. Richard I, known across Europe as the Lionheart, was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary military figures of the 12th century, and accounts of his Third Crusade preserve a detail that has fascinated and disturbed historians ever since. The Itinerarium Peregrinorum et Gesta Regis Ricardi, a Latin chronicle of the Crusade written close to the events themselves, contains a passage describing Richard being served a dish prepared from the head of a Saracen enemy, a dark joke by his cooks, or perhaps a deliberate spectacle which Richard reportedly consumed without complaint and without apparent horror. The account is brief, possibly embellished, and comes from a text written with the explicit purpose of glorifying Richard, which makes its inclusion of this episode all the more striking. Crusade chronicles more broadly, including those covering the Siege of Marat in 1098, predating the Plantagenets, but involving the Norman noble networks from which Plantagenet culture directly descended, are explicit that Crusader forces consumed the flesh of dead Muslims and possibly their own dead during that siege, driven partly by hunger and partly, some chroniclers suggest, by deliberate psychological warfare against the local population. Albert of Auchin's chronicle is among the clearest on this point. Richard's own death in 1199 from a crossbow bolt at Châlus-Chabrol produced a final act that illustrates how thoroughly medieval royal culture understood the body as a political object. His heart was removed, separately embalmed, and buried at Rouen Cathedral, while his brain and entrails were interred at Châlus and the rest of his body at Fontevraud Abbey. The heart of a great lord was understood to carry his essence, his courage, his authority, and in that symbolic framework, the consumption of an enemy's heart by a victorious rival lord was not meaningless gore, but a comprehensible act of political absorption. The Plantagenet entry is not a story of systematic institutional cannibalism, but it is a story of a dynasty operating within a culture of ritualized violence so complete and so normalized that occasional crossing of the boundary between symbolic and literal consumption of the enemy body was treated, by contemporaries, as worth recording but not worth condemning. The Luba Kingdom. In the region of Central Africa that is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, centered around the great freshwater basin of Lake Kisale, the Luba Empire stood for roughly 4 centuries as one of the most politically sophisticated kingdoms sub-Saharan Africa produced. Its kings, the Mulapwe, a title meaning sacred ruler, were understood to be not merely political leaders, but living embodiments of divine authority, their bodies literally containing the spiritual force that held the kingdom together. Within that framework, what happened to a royal body in death or defeat carried consequences that extended far beyond the personal. Oral traditions preserved by Luba historians and later recorded by anthropologists, most notably Mary Neuter Roberts in her scholarship on Luba visual culture, describe practices in which the heart and liver of a defeated rival king were consumed by the victor as an act of legitimate spiritual transfer. The Mulopwe's power did not die with his body, but could be absorbed, claimed, redirected into the body of the new ruler who had overcome him. War medicine, known broadly as dawa, was a related practice. Royal warriors going into battle were sometimes given preparations that incorporated human blood or flesh, sanctioned and distributed through the royal hierarchy, believed to confer invincibility and ferocity in combat. The Luba also developed the Lukasa, a handheld memory board covered in beads and shells encoding complex historical and genealogical knowledge, a uniquely sophisticated archival technology that now sits in museum collections in Europe and North America, a reminder that the same civilization, capable of this intellectual elegance, also maintained practices that European observers found incomprehensible. The historical record here requires careful handling because Belgian colonial authorities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries used accusations of cannibalism, sometimes documented, sometimes fabricated, almost always exaggerated as political justification for the extraordinarily brutal suppression of Luba resistance and the annexation of the Congo in 1908. King Leopold II's regime in the Congo Free State killed an estimated 10 million people. The colonizers who documented Luba cannibalism were simultaneously committing atrocities that dwarfed anything they described. That context does not erase the practices, but it makes uncritical reliance on Belgian colonial sources deeply problematic, and the most reliable scholarly work on Luba ritual life treats those sources with corresponding skepticism. The Tupinamba chieftains. On the green Atlantic coast of what is now Brazil, from the state of Maranhão down toward Rio de Janeiro, the Tupinamba Confederacy of Chieftains, the Morubixaba, presiding over their villages, ran a system of ritual cannibalism so extensively documented by 16th-century European observers that it remains, to this day, among the best evidenced cases of institutionalized human consumption in world history. Hans Staden, a German gunner who was captured by the Tupinamba in 1552 and held for roughly 9 months before escaping, published his illustrated account in 1557 under the title Warhaftige Historia. It became one of the best-selling books in 16th-century Europe, its woodcut illustrations of roasting human limbs and feasting villagers burning into the European imagination. Jean de Léry, a French Calvinist missionary who lived among the Tupinamba in 1557 and 1558, published his own account in 1578, more measured than Staden's. Genuinely curious about Tupinamba cosmology and widely respected by modern anthropologists for its relative carefulness. Both men described a system in which captive enemy warriors were brought back to the village alive and held, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. During their captivity, they were fed well, given wives, allowed freedom of movement, and treated, in many respects, as guests. They knew exactly what was coming, and some accounts describe the captives composing songs about their own deaths, taunting their captors with detailed promises of the revenge their surviving kin would one day take, while their captors replied with equally detailed accounts of how they would be eaten. When the day of the ceremony arrived, it was the chief's privilege or a warrior elevated by the chief for the honor to deliver the killing blow with a carved wooden club painted red with uruku dye. The body was then divided by rank, the distribution overseen by the Morubixaba, with specific portions assigned to specific categories of people. The flesh was smoked and roasted, bones were cleaned and in some cases carved into flutes played at subsequent ceremonies. and the entire event lasted multiple days, with the whole village participating under the organizational authority of the chief. The motivation was explicitly and repeatedly described by the Tupinamba themselves to their European observers. This was revenge cosmology, a system in which you consumed your enemy to honor your own dead, to carry out justice across generations, and to complete a cycle that the universe required. It was not hunger. It was not hatred in any simple sense. It was, in its own framework, a form of grief expressed as appetite, and the chieftains who presided over it understood themselves to be fulfilling a sacred obligation to their ancestors, the Royal House of Hawaii. When Captain James Cook sailed into Kealakekua Bay on the Big Island of Hawaii in January 1779, he was met with a reception that suggested the Hawaiians may have associated him with the god Lono, arriving at exactly the right moment in the ritual calendar on a ship whose masts resembled the crossed poles of Lono's icon. When he left and then unexpectedly returned a few weeks later after storm damage to his ship, something in that sacred framework broke. Tensions escalated rapidly, and on the 14th of February 1779, Cook was killed on the beach in a chaotic confrontation. What happened to his body afterward has been debated by historians ever since. Hawaiian chiefs did take portions of his remains. His bones were cleaned and distributed among high-ranking alii, which was the standard treatment of an honored or powerful enemy whose mana was worth preserving and claiming. Whether any consumption of flesh occurred is genuinely disputed, and responsible historians flag it as contested. What is not contested is the framework that would have made such an act meaningful if it did occur. The Ali'i Nui, the high chiefs who sat at the apex of Hawaiian society, who would within a generation be recognized as a formal royal dynasty under Kamehameha I, operated within a system in which mana, spiritual power, was the central currency of political life, and the body of a powerful person was understood to be literally saturated with it. To absorb a rival chief's mana by consuming his body was not a foreign or monstrous concept in that framework. It was a logical extension of the same spiritual economics that governed every other aspect of chiefly life. Kamehameha I, who united the Hawaiian Islands through a series of wars beginning in the 1790s and completed by roughly 1810, is associated in oral traditions with ritual acts following major military victories that fit this pattern, though the oral historical record here requires the same careful sourcing as any tradition preserved through generations of telling. The kapu system, the elaborate network of sacred prohibitions that governed Hawaiian society, including strict rules about who could eat what and in whose presence, treated food itself as a political instrument of the first order. When Kamehameha II abolished the kapu system in 1819 by publicly eating with women, an act previously forbidden under pain of death, he was not simply changing a dining rule. He was dismantling the entire cosmological structure that made his dynasty's power sacred, and within that structure, the ritual use of the body as food had been one of the most extreme expressions of chiefly authority available. The Wari of Western Brazil. In the deep rainforest of what is now the state of Rondônia in western Brazil, the Wari people, known to outsiders for most of the 20th century, by the colonial name Pacá Nova, practiced a form of cannibalism that forces a complete rethinking of what the word even means, because everything about it was the opposite of what most people imagine when they encounter the subject. The Wari did not eat their enemies. They ate their own beloved dead. And they did so not out of hunger, not out of cruelty, and not out of any desire to absorb power or send a political message. They did it because they loved them, and because allowing a body to decompose in the ground sealed away from the community, left to rot alone in the dark, was, in their understanding, the truly horrifying option. The practice was endocannibalism, the consumption of one's own group's dead as a funerary act, overseen and organized by the elder and chiefly figures who held authority within Wari social structure. The body of a deceased community member was prepared and shared at a funeral feast, with the participation of relatives and community members understood as the most complete possible expression of grief and love. A refusal to abandon the dead person, a final act of incorporation that kept them, literally, within the living community. Beth Conklin, an anthropologist who conducted extensive fieldwork with the Wari and published her findings in Consuming Grief in 2001 through the University of Texas Press, provides the most detailed and carefully sourced account available. What makes her work particularly remarkable is that it includes the voices of elderly Wari people who remembered the practice and who described the shift to Christian burial customs imposed by Brazilian government pacification. campaigns and missionary pressure in the 1960s as one of the most painful losses their community has experienced. They describe the old practice with a complex mixture of sorrow and nostalgia, and they describe ground burial as leaving the dead alone, in a way that feels, to them, like abandonment. The chiefly and elder structure that organized the funerary feasts was not incidental to the practice, it was essential, because these were not spontaneous individual acts, but community ceremonies, requiring recognized authority to convene and conduct. The Wari case does not fit neatly into a video about powerful rulers using cannibalism as a weapon of domination, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. It fits because it demonstrates the outermost boundary of what cannibalism as a culturally organized, leadership-sanctioned practice can mean, not the most extreme expression of power over enemies, but the most extreme expression of devotion to the people you have lost. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.